Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this exclusive EGX panel. My name's Tomas Rawlings, and I'm the studio director at Auroch Digital, and I'm delighted to be joined by a bunch of my peers and colleagues, and we are going to be dissecting the exciting phenomena of hobby games. So let me run around the screen and introduce these wonderful people, starting with Jack.
Hey, my name's Jack. I'm a programmer. I'm working on Brewmaster, which is our hobby simulation homebrew game. My background is in science, so we'll talk a bit about the science of simulation and trying to get that right and that balance right later.
Amazing, thank you, Jack. And Andres.
Hi, my name is Andres. I am also a programmer on Brewmaster, and like Jack, I also I come from the outside the games industry. I come from the medical industry, and I'll talk about how that is helping with working on Brewmaster.
Perfect, and welcome. And we are also joined by Eren.
Hi, my name's Eren. I have a history in flight simulators, which is obviously very different to Brewmaster, which is what I'm currently working on, and we'll go into that a bit later.
Wonderful. And Stefan?
Hi, I'm Stefan. I was a programmer on Mars Horizon, and before joining the games industry, I worked in architecture, engineering, and construction simulations using games technology.
Brilliant. And last but not least, our colleague Jem.
I'm Jem. I'm the marketing and community manager here at Auroch. I worked on a few simulation titles, including Brewmaster, Mars Horizon, and also Mega Aquarium, which is an aquarium simulation management game. So just have a lot of passion and experience working on these kind of games and be excited to talk about it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves, and let's dive straight into the topic. I think the first to me is interesting thing is obviously somebody who works in games, plays games, fascinated by games, lives, breathes games. Noticed this phenomena, a couple of years ago of what we are now calling hobby simulations. So, I mean, I would define that as a game that simulates something that somebody might do as a job or a hobby, which differs to me from simulations like flight simulators. And of course, some people would do that for a job if you're a fighter pilot or something like that, but that's rare. Whereas, there's plenty of simulations like Truck Driver Simulator, something like PC Build Simulator, and those are much more. There's a lot more people do those as actual jobs. So, do you think I've got that Do you think I've got that title and that definition of what we think those sort of simulations are right, or am I missing something in how I see it? Eren, what do you think? Have I got that right?
So I would say, yeah, about right. I think that whenever we talk about simulations, there's a really vast variance in all the different types. And you do range from things like the flight simulators, where it is for all means you could actually fly a plane after playing that game, or in my experience, there was pilots that did play it quite regularly. So it definitely sort of coincides with something that some people have. But you have on the reverse side things like, for example, farming simulator. Not every farmer is probably going to be playing farming simulator, and it doesn't maybe necessarily have the correlations to real life that other simulators do, but there's always that side of it. And so I think when we talk about it, there's always that broad spectrum. But in the case of what we're doing, for example, with Brewmaster, it's realistic, but also enjoyable and might not correlate exactly to what you do in real life, although it's as much as we can.
Which is a good point in that definition, Jack. Do you feel then that what you and the rest of the team are building in Brewmaster, is that a simulation, or is it just a game that happens to have brewing in it?
So, I mean, from my perspective, like the word simulation, like we're using it in a very specific context here, and like the word simulation is much broader. So it is a simulation. Like all games are a form of a simulation. But in terms of like being a simulation game, yeah, I think it's a simulation game, and it's more on that like the hobby end of the spectrum. But we try and tie in as much into real life. We have real recipes of real beers in the game. And then you can follow a recipe, and then you can follow those instructions within the game, and you'll get the right sort of beer out at the end. So it's sort of somewhere in between.
Okay, so it sounds like that there is an element of mirroring, or at least tracking some degree of the reality of it.
Yeah,
Andreas, you've worked on, as you said, simulations outside of this. The sort of stuff we're building in a game, as opposed to stuff that you've done outside of this, does it feel like a simulation in that sense, or because it's a game, are we doing things really differently?
I think specifically Brewmaster, I think it's similar in that we want the in-game, actual science and chemistry of it to actually be real, right? And or as close to real as we could possibly get it, so that if you did follow those steps exactly in real life, you would get a similar or the exact same result in real life. So in that sense, yes. But then you have this other layer on top of it where, it is a game, right? So there is things like progression and things tied to it that, the stuff that is very game specific that wouldn't be something we would consider outside of a game like Brewmaster, right? So I agree that it's kind of a spectrum, right? And Brewmaster again does kind of lie in the middle where it's not 100% just a set of tools of, here's a chemistry simulation and that's it. But it is also not just 100% a game. There is actual, real life analogs to everything we do in the game as well.
Brilliant. That's good. And Jem, on some of the simulation stuff. So take Megaquarium, that we worked on Twice Circled's brilliant title that we ported over. How much of the real life activity of running an aquarium again is simulation, and how much of it is there's a tank, throw some fish in kind of thing?
So it's about getting that important balance, I think, between being fun but being accurate. So with games like Megaquarium and also like Mars Horizon, you're doing like a collection of different jobs. So you're managing the budgets, deadlines, you're managing the different fish in the tanks, you're choosing the different parts for the rockets, you're choosing when to launch a rocket. So you would never have one person that does all of these tasks, but they're the fun and exciting bits. And you want to have, if you're having a game like this, you want to have as many different parts as possible that you can be involved in. Because if you just did one part, it'd still be fun, but it's a lot more fun to sort of step back. And also in all of the titles, you sort of take away some of the not as fun bits. So you don't have the cleaning and things in Brewmaster. You don't have to actually wait for weeks. You can sort of skip those bits. Mars Horizon, if your rocket blows up, you can just try again, depending on what settings you have. So I think, you want to have, but also you really want to have the true to life bits and the realism, because people really love to see the things they're passionate about reflected. So we have a lot of with Megaquarium. When I was doing the marketing, we had a lot of like aquarists, so that's people who work in aquariums, say how much they love the game, and sort of they, you couldn't just put any fish together because they would fight or eat each other just like in real life. So they enjoyed seeing their jobs reflected in that, and also people learned a lot about fish as they played, because I didn't know anything about aquariums when I started playing the game, and now I know that you couldn't house the Pacific octopus with any other creature because it will eat all of them.
So and Stefan, when you were working on Mars Horizon, which simulator of running a space agency, we obviously got feedback from people at the European Space Agency and the UK Space Agency. Were you a bit nervous they're going to be like actual people doing this job for real life looking at your work?
Yeah, that was a stressful experience when we sent the game off to the European Space Agency. But we got really good feedback when we did, and I think the biggest thing we got wrong was that there wasn't enough paperwork. There's a whole lot more paperwork in real life, but I'm glad we didn't put that in. It wouldn't have been very good.
No, that's great.
Yeah,
we should have stuck in the loop of paperwork, definitely. But sorry.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a paperwork DLC that can be worked in there somewhere. Yeah, it was really cool to get some feedback from people that played the game, and some of the coolest feedback we got was also from people who didn't work for the European Space Agency, but were professors in Barcelona in like some astrophysics, I believe was the degree or whatever they were doing. But essentially, like, there were people who were playing the game with their kids, and then it was a good way of showing their kids the sort of thing that they would do professionally, and that was really cool. And so, yeah, there was a lot of really neat feedback, and but yeah, it was a very stressful experience to send it off and hope that we got the game right, because obviously none of us were professionals working for a space agency. So.
We were professionals, I like to think, but yeah, not necessarily space agencies. But
yeah.
But going at there's a proliferation of these sort of games on Steam, and obviously we've talked about games that we're involved in: Brewmaster, Mars Horizon, Megaquarium. I mean, what other games have we seen coming up on Steam and in other places? And what do you think those games tell us about it? So maybe I'll kind of kick it off. I think recently there was a game, Power Wash Simulator, that came out, and when I first heard about it, I was thinking, does that sound like a lot of fun? I'm not sure I would enjoy that. And then when I watched some gameplay of it, and there's something really, I want to use the word cleansing, but maybe that's the wrong word, but there's something really soothing about watching the footage of somebody just cleaning stuff and it coming out all nice and shiny and clean. And it felt like there's a simplicity here. I wash stuff, I get paid, I buy better power washers, and I thought, no, I get that now. I get why. I did not think that would be a thing, but clearly it is. Like what else have people seen that they thought, okay, either yes, that's definitely a thing and it should be, or I didn't expect that to be a simulation game, but it is. I mean, Andreas, have you spotted anything that made you surprised or pleased?
For me, I think it's the kind of making musical simulation accessible to people like me who may not be, the most dexterous or even the most musical in real life, but you put it to me in a games term and you attach a score to everything and things, and suddenly I'm off running. Like the one I've been playing a lot of recently is Fuser, which is like I wouldn't say it's 100% like DJ simulation, but as far as me, someone who's not a DJ himself, it's as close as I will ever get, right? And it's a lot of fun, like putting together these mixes and then sending them to friends and comparing and then like being able to like then listen to those mixes I've made myself, right? It's really cool, and it's as close as I will ever get to being a real DJ. And there's it's great that I can experience something like that without necessarily having the real life skills or equipment to actually do it well.
Right. No, that's great. It's that experience. And Stefan, what games have you seen that again capture that idea of an experience that you may or may not have actually been able to get that easily?
Well, as a millennial, there's no way I'm going to buy a house. So House Flipper is definitely on the list.
Classic
Yeah.
Very good, very topical. Yeah.
Relapse.
But what do you do in House Flipper? Like I've messed around with it a bit, but not that much.
It's a similar concept to I guess it's similar to the whole cleaning things up with that you get in Power Wash, but you start off in like derelict houses and clean them up and improve them, and then you just go through the whole process of decorating them, laying everything out. I think there's a Garden Flipper DLC as part of that as well, which is the same sort of concept, cleaning everything up. I think there's a real satisfying nature to taking something that's just nasty and making it nice in a way. There's just something nice about that whole experience. Yeah,
Cool.
that's really it's a cool one.
That's great. And Jem, what about you? What have you seen floating around?
When people sort of do the mundane, so Power Simulator is one, you get Lawnmower Simulator, and really big right now, Gas Station Simulator. They're just sort of like calm, nice ways to relax and unwind. And I think people are looking for that. Games don't always have to be stressful and intense. They can just be like just enjoying yourself and just sort of maybe listen to a podcast at the same time or just chat to friends. And so when I play games like Planet Zoo, I really love, or Jurassic Park, Jurassic World Evolution. And I used to play a lot as a kid. Jurassic Park Operation Genesis is where you'd set my zoo up on my park, and then I just like to watch the animals, just sort of run around, have a nice time, maybe get some new toys. So like, yeah, just enjoying a way to relax and unwind, sort of sit back.
I think that's a really good point, Jem. The idea that games, like there used to be this concept that like proper computer games with all the like fast-paced action games, where you had to be like headshot, and things have moved past that now, and that's quite nice. Like people just want like a nice way to spend their time doing a nice thing. So
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people last year played a 60-hour delivery boy simulator game in Death Stranding, and I spent the majority of that game just listening to podcasts, and it was great.
And delivering, I hope. Or were you just like, yeah, I'm not going to bother delivering now?
I suppose where we're all so busy all the time, a game that sort of it sort of forces you to sit down and take things a bit slower for a while and just chill out. Whereas I wouldn't just sit down and stare at my screen and listen to a podcast. Like it sort of gives me an excuse. It gives me something to do that isn't too much going on, which I think is quite important.
Yeah, and Eren, have you seen anything in the kind of hobby sim space that's kind of made you sort of take notice?
I would say for me, so moving away from, obviously, I absolutely love all the relaxing ones. Anything like Stardew Valley, absolutely hours. I probably have hundreds of hours in that game. So those sort of typical ones I'm really into, but I would say the ones that sort of go a little bit further. So things like job simulation and like surgeon simulation, all those sort of ones where it's got that sort of quirkiness to it, where it's sort of hinting at a profession or a hobby or something, but at the same time it's like, but how far can we take that?
Yeah.
And it's about like pushing the idea of people's day-to-day jobs, and I can't imagine how hilarious it would be to play that sort of game after being, for example, a surgeon and looking at it and be like, none of that's right. But that's half of the fun of it, is it's not quite right. And although it's definitely not relaxing, I think there's an appeal to that side of hobby and job simulators where we sort of just take the mundane and go, right, okay, what can we do with this?
So we've talked a little bit touched on this, but what I'd be interested to know is to what extent are these games making that real job accessible, sort of giving you a sense of it. And like I say, we touched on this little, but what struck me as interesting in talking to the community for Brewmaster, for example, I've seen, and maybe I'm misrepresenting this slightly, but about half of our players who've kind of contacted us, messaged us, that sort of thing, seem to be people who are really interested in brewing, don't actually do it, but see this as a great way of finding out more. And about half the people we've chatted to do brewing to some degree or another, and are very interested to see how we represent what they do. So it's like that weird mix. Like where do you think, to what degree do you see the hobby simulation needs to show this is what it's really like, paperwork simulator, and to what degree do you think it should be like, here's the fun with it, like surgeon simulator, okay, your spleen's gone, but who cares, kind of thing. I mean, who wants to grab on that point first?
I can sort of
Thank
touch
you.
on it.
Yeah.
So I think the area that sort of covers is, especially for people, for example, I love beer. I was into beer before joining Brewmaster, but I had always dabbled in the idea of home brewing, but never really gone for it. And I'm not sure I ever will, because honestly, researching this game has just shown me how much effort and how delicate it is. So I think there's definitely that room in simulators and stuff like that, where it's a hobby you think you might be interested in, but you're not really going to sink the hundreds and hundreds of pounds and all the effort that goes into it. And I think a lot of sort of the more traditional simulators really can cover that. And also, if, for example, another one, farming, any sort of farming thing, I don't want to be a farmer. It's not something I've ever wanted to do, yet I find farming really relaxing in a video game. And I think for a lot of people, there's these sort of weird parts of their life where they're like, oh, it'd be really relaxing if I just did this for a job. But the reality is you would never want to do that. And I think that these sort of games can fill that gap for a lot of people, and that's why they are so appealing, especially right now, I think.
Well, on that with Brewmaster, what would be interesting to know is, like, I know we chatted about this obviously in the early days of the game, but the chemical simulation, which I think both of you and Andreas and Jack have mentioned, like, to what degree is that a proper chemical simulation of things, and to what degree is it like, I mean, I assume to actually simulate on a molecular level chemistry, you probably need a supercomputer the size of the planet, but it isn't like a surface thing of like, click here, make beer. It's way more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, there's a whole range of chemistry simulation, and as part of my PhD, I was doing quantum physics and got to speak to some really smart people who do like quantum chemistry simulations, and that's the kind of like, that's the real deal end of the spectrum, where you have like supercomputers, and then you're simulating the chemistry of like a single molecule, and that will take hours and hours and hours on this like huge machine, with really smart minds like doing crazy optimizations. And obviously you can't go that far, and there's no need to go that far. But so there are loads of physical measurements of things in real life that people have measured. So like how the volume of water changes between 0 degrees and 100 degrees, like you can look those numbers up on Wikipedia. And although we don't actually put that effect in the game, but that kind of thing is where you can go like, okay, we know that if you add 100 grams of sugar to a liter of water, you change like the relative density in that kind of way. So we're not simulating the like the molecules, but we're simulating like the sort of formulaic changes, and those are based on real life as much as we can. Okay. If that makes sense.
No, that does. And
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I've seen in the simulation stuff that I think is, again, as somebody tangentially involved in the tech side, very tangentially, but I'd be interested, Andreas, on this is like the simulation of the liquid part of it, which looks fantastic, and you've all done amazing work on that. How tricky is that? Because surely just pouring stuff, that's pretty basic. We pour things all the time.
I mean, you hit the magic word there with pouring, but if we want to talk about it generally, I mean, liquid simulation turns out is a pretty complicated thing, and a lot of it is, how much are we willing to flub it, and how much do we want it to be real? And with pouring, we decided, well, we want it to, not just be a canned static animation. We want it to actually be this dynamic thing that changes depending on how much you're pouring and what container you're pouring from, and what is inside the container and what's inside the liquid. So that's a lot of time and research has been spent on what's the best method to get this like dynamic pouring in, and that doesn't just apply to pouring, that applies to across the board. We always talk about like, are we going to simulate every individual yeast cell, or are we just going to say, okay, well, let's do groups of colonies and then simulate those? It's very much like how much realism are we willing to sacrifice to versus practicality, right? And we have these discussions all the time, and we try our best to lean towards realism as much as possible without it being too much to ask for.
Yeah, no.
A key thing that you said in there that is also like that it's dynamic, and that's important as well. So like, because it's the simulation, even though you're not going down to a deep level, you're going down enough levels so that if you change something, then it will change in the way that you might expect in real life. So it's deep enough to get that dynamic behavior is what we're going for.
I think when we were working on one of the early demos of Mars Horizon, and we had lots of things going wrong that the player on the design side that the player had to balance out in order so that there was plenty for them to do. And when we met, so when the European Space Agency first sent somebody over, this lovely guy called Emma, he came over and we showed him the demo and that. And I sort of said, well, obviously we're making loads of things go wrong so that there's something to happen in the game. And I was really pleased when he said, oh, actually, loads of stuff goes wrong anyway. It's just, we don't tend not to talk about that a lot because it's just a bit frightening if you see how many things can go wrong, which of course, space being a complicated thing. So, Stefan, in the work you've done in the real world sector where you're simulating stuff, and then come across into something like Mars Horizon, which is a different type of simulation, but equally they're both trying to, the player is trying to figure out the right way of doing stuff so it doesn't actually go wrong. I mean, does the work you've done before, did that come over quite helpful, or did they turn out to be jarringly different?
I mean, I think in the real world simulations, you have no margin for error. You kind of have to simulate everything correctly, whereas in games you get a lot more freedom with the constraints that you can impose, and something that could go wrong, you can kind of just shuffle off to the side if it's too intrusive, or you can wrap some safeties around it from a gameplay point of view. There was a lot of things we did in Mars Horizon in some cases where we protect the player in ways that sort of hide some of the issues that you might face early on, so that you don't get too attacked from every angle. Whereas later on, you lift some of those constraints and that sort of thing. But in the real world, you cannot have any kind of situation where you bypass a problem. You need to make sure that everything is simulated correctly at all times, because one thing that isn't highlighted could then lead to, you know, a massive real world problem that you didn't get because of your simulation. Yeah, I think in terms of the gameplay for Mars Horizon, we had a lot more freedom in terms of what we could do, and what we could leave out.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting, because then it strikes me then the potential thing between what the player's expecting from a simulation and what the game's going to deliver. And Jem, you spend a lot of time obviously talking with our player base, and helping them, you know, communicating. I think it's always key that we communicate what we've actually made, so that they don't buy a thing, you know, like they don't buy Mars Horizon thinking they bought Kerbal Space Program, which there's nothing wrong with. Brilliant game, fantastic physics simulation, but we've made a very different game. And, you know, what's that like, communicating the player, making sure they know what it is they're getting is what we've made?
Yeah, it's really important, like especially because simulation is such a broad type of game, as we said at the beginning. It can be so many different things, so it's really important that people know what they're getting. We do alphas and betas with our games. We include video as much as possible early on. So with Brewmaster, we initially announced with a sort of early concept trailer, so people would get a feel for it. And now the game looks very different, and looks way more awesome. And we're, you know, going to have betas and alphas before it's launched. But yeah, I think it's just making sure not just the wording you're using, but trying to show the player as much as possible what kind of thing we're trying to simulate. Because yeah, I think we have a lot of shared fans with Kerbal and Mars Horizon, because people who love space, and they're both like, you know, they worked with NASA and we worked with ESA, but ultimately very different games as well, and simulating different parts of space exploration.
And Eren, one of the things I think is interesting, and looking at the kind of art that's being created, again in this perceptual thing of, you know, it's great if on a technical level it does the simulation accurately to what the real thing is, but the player also has to then look at it and it looks like it should. But obviously you and the team you're working with are very heavily involved in that, and you've done that in the flight sims and now in the Brewmaster. How much work does it take to make an object, be it a hangar, a part of an aeroplane, or a glass or a barrel? How much work does it take to get that looking really like it should look?
I think the interesting thing that I found, at least with Brewmaster, is because there is a level of stylized to it. It's not quite true to life. So we have like some nice shaders. We can get a little bit creative with things. The problem with flight sims is the second you deviate from something, there's always somebody that's worked on one of those things or knows it inside out, and immediately they're on you for that. And that's fair, because you know it's their passion. So that's, you know, absolutely no problem there. But I have to admit, it's quite nice with Brewmaster knowing that I can make a pot and nobody's going to scrutinize that pot too badly. So I think the really important thing with all these sort of elements with simulators as well is that there's some simulators we expect to be quite realistic and to sort of mimic life, and there's other things where it's like you can have that creative control like Brewmaster. So with the liquids, for example, we want that to simulate real life because you're expecting a feedback from it. We want to give the player that feedback. But in terms of how, for example, each of the bottles looks or how some branding looks, we have real creative control with that. And I think, especially with Brewmaster, that's been really fun because we've been able to sort of like experiment with different atmospheres, how we want the player to feel when they're actually standing in the brewing rooms, how they're feeling when they're tasting beer, stuff like that. So we can sort of go into different levels of detail and try and give different moods depending on the actual thing that we're trying to portray. And again, if you look against, for example, the stuff that the public's seen of Brewmaster compared to Mars Horizon, they're two very different looking games. And in their own rights, they look completely fine. So I think that's sort of the joy of simulators, is they can be anything you want them to be, or they can be completely realistic.
That's a great explanation. And what I was going to ask everybody is, you know, we talked about why do we think there's a growing interest in these sort of games, but and I'll come around to everybody in that moment. Just before we do, you mentioned Eren, shader, and Stefan, I was going to ask if you could tell the audience quickly what shader is, because you're doing a masterclass on this for trainees in Bristol, which is very kind of you. So yeah, what's a super 5-second explanation of what a shader is?
Super quick explanation is how we take a 3D representation of an object and make it 2D, and how we process the colors on the screen. Big old little bit of a program that takes this 3D point in space and makes it flat on your screen with the right color.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and thanks for running that masterclass. I'm very excited to see the outcome of that. Okay, so yeah, I said we're going to go around and say why people are interested in it. So I think one of the first simulator games that I played, more recent crop. I mean, when I'm old enough that when flight sims were a massive deal, like when computer game magazines were a thing and there was a new flight sim coming out, we would like cover news. And simulator games have gone from when I was younger being like massive genres to still substantial, but then they're not quite the same sort of. The industry is much broader than it used to be there. But yeah, the one that I played is Goat Simulator, which I'm happy to report is not an accurate simulator of being a goat, apart from the bleating. It's a lot of fun. It's very silly, and to me, it was almost like I think you talked about Eren with Surgeon Simulator, like they're playing with the idea of simulator in that it's sort of simulating, but it's not. But it's great fun. Really enjoyed playing it. Had a lot of silliness with Goat Simulator, and for me, that's the silliness factor was the big draw there. Of other simulator games that people have seen out there, what do you think the draw is? Like, why do people want to play Power Wash Simulator, House Flipper, PC Build Simulator? What's going on in there? We've alluded to some of this. So if I bring you in, Jem, first, you're in contact with a lot of people. What's bringing people into these simulation games?
I think you've got the relaxing, as mentioned before. Sorry, is his typing too loud? Can you hear the typing?
Yeah.
Can you stop? Your typing's coming through on the recording. Sorry. The joys of working from home.
Home office simulator.
I want to be really immersive as if I was in an actual office, but it's just my front room. So apart from the relaxing side of things, I think a lot of people are using these games to learn. So as I said, a lot of people learn about animals from and fish from Megaquarium. And Planet Zoo, a little story the Planet Zoo days was talking is there's people writing in saying like, oh, I think there's an error with my game. The lemurs keep T-posing. And they're like, no, that's actually how lemurs jump around in real life. They sort of have their arms to the side. So people are like learning about animals through the game, which I think is nice. And then we have had a lot of people say around Brewmaster, like, oh, I'd like to get into brewing, but it is a very complex thing, even at the beginner levels. So this is a good way to help them understand the basics and what you would need to invest time-wise, and so what equipment you would need, even on a small scale. And I think there's a lot of other games that do that for people and let them see, what's involved in, if it's one of the more realistic ones, what's involved in the activity.
So Andreas, then for you mentioned Fuser. It was the kind of the fantasy of getting to do something that you might not get to do. DJ, run a DJ session. Do you think that's a big draw? The kind of the fantasy, the conceit of what you could do?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think the big thing, at least for me, and I know a lot of other people are like this, is it's being able to dabble in something that you have an interest in, but would otherwise be this giant commitment and huge barrier of entry. I mean, even just Googling, like, how do I get started being a DJ? It's like simple beginner guide, and it's like 500 pages long, right? with hundreds of thousands of dollars that you could possibly invest in, and it's like, do I need to spend this much money? It's like, I don't know. But with a game, you spend the money, and then it, slowly, ideally, would slowly teach you and kind of walk you through it and hold your hand. And then, once that initial, curve has been, once you've rounded that first initial hill, then you could look up those beginner guides if you're still interested, and suddenly the words on the paper make sense. Suddenly it's not jargon, it's not a different language. It's okay, I understand what they're saying. I sort of see what this is telling me to do. And I think that's one of the biggest benefits is it's, lowering that bar of entry and sort of walking you through those initial steps so that then you could take that knowledge outside if you really want to.
That's really interesting. And Eren, you've worked on flight sims as well as Brewmaster. Like, how many of the people on the flight sims are people who kind of, maybe would one day like to be a pilot, or is it just it's an area that interests them? Did you ever get that kind of player feedback?
We did to some level. So we had open forums that anybody could comment on. So whenever we released anything, we could just go through and see how sort of the response to it was. How, especially, it was really interesting seeing people that lived in that area, and they would be like, "Oh, this is how this looks." you've done a really good job or you've done terribly. Overall. But I think the interesting side of that is, although there were a lot of professional, almost professional players, they had these huge setups, like you've seen them online, like almost like a plane in their front room. It's crazy. And then you had the people that were just playing it for fun. And I think for anyone from the professional side to it, to even just the people that are just doing it for fun, it's a really important level of escapism for a lot of people, where maybe something in their life they're not too happy about, so they can just sort of retreat to this. I think that's what most games do for a lot of people, and I know me personally, it's how I got into games when I was younger with like Zelda and stuff like that. Was that level of escapism and removing myself from almost a real world. And I think some people, they almost need that replication of real life to fall into it properly and to have those levels. So with Flight Sim, for example, you could just fly a plane around using a couple keys if you wanted to, or you could go full depth in and have all the gauges up and everything. And I think part of that is definitely important, where you have those different levels to fit everyone. And that sort of helps with that escapism for a lot of people, because if you want to, you can go full on. If you don't, you can just mind numb, listen to a podcast like everyone's said before, and just play the game.
So in Mars Horizon, Stefan, like, I wonder, did you ever think that other people playing this game who will then go on to do some kind of job in the space industry? I mean, did that cross your mind on working on it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think a lot of the people that we've spoken to who played Mars Horizon were really passionate about the space industry on the whole. People really wanted to get into the space industry, or they just found it fascinating, or they were working on degrees to get into the space industry. We had people who were working in the space industry. I think there were a lot of people who really were not playing the game to move towards that, obviously, but it's something they were passionate about, and they wanted to just keep experiencing that sort of thing. And yeah, it's definitely an avenue that I think, if you want to get into a career or a hobby, these kind of simulation games definitely lead you down that path. And I think Andreas put it perfectly when he was talking as well, and that it's something that you want to try, then having a lower barrier of entry, even if it's just experiencing it a little bit, not really, but whatever the simulation is, it's really a nice way of testing something out and just seeing if you enjoy something.
Okay, so I'm interested to know, there's a few titles out there that simulate what we do, game development. So like Game Dev Tycoon, Game Dev Story. I think there was another one recently as well I saw pop up. How good if you played one of those, how good a simulation are those of the actual job we do of developing games? Anyone had any experience of playing them?
I've played a lot of Game Dev Tycoon prior to being a game developer. I'm not sure how well it translates, but you could definitely get the development life cycle and part of the waiting for the reviews to come in, and are we gonna keep making money? Is this one gonna sink us? And that whole term. But yeah. I think there's a very loose sense of the job in there. But obviously, in terms of Game Dev Tycoon, it essentially skips over the development problems that you would have.
Is that's the equivalent of the paperwork bit, isn't it? It's like insert
that's the paperwork
game here, yeah, insert core game here. Okay, got a couple of minutes left. Just in the last couple of minutes, is there something that somebody's looking forward to, upcoming simulation game, or something that somebody thinks would make a good simulation game or a terrible simulation game? And I say it in a joking way because I imagine it will get made at some point, which will be both fascinating and scary. So for me, I think one of the things that I think would be interesting to see would be, is somebody going to make, we've seen YouTubers' life come out and, simulates the kind of YouTuber. I've not seen anyone adapt that more into the streaming world, where the kind of regular scheduled streaming stuff. I wonder if they're going to adapt that. Would be the thing that I'd be interested to see if somebody does a simulation, and again, how well that tracks if you're actually a streamer and YouTuber, how well that goes. Anybody got any other ones that pop into their head that they think that would be interesting?
Someone I used to go to school with is a pool cleaner now, and he's actually really famous on TikTok. He's gone viral. So I think, you get like Power Simulator, and I think it's because his videos are very like, there's a manky pool, it's all dirty, and he cleans it up gradually, and you see the steps, and at the end it looks amazing. So I can see like it being another one of those kind of relaxing cleaning type games, pool cleaning simulator, because it has a lot of views. So there's people out there who want to watch it.
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is a job / hobby that's been gaining incredible popularity recently is drag queens and doing
that's a good idea.
drag, and it's been absolutely blowing up in the last couple of years. I think a drag queen simulation game is inevitable, where you start going to your local clubs, making pounds or dollars as from tips, and then you slowly work your way up the food chain to international drag queen.
That sounds cool.
Amazing. You could have to like learn to do the
great.
hair and makeup, and you'd start off like really bad, and by the end you'd have more money for like really good wigs and outfits. That would be really cool. I'll play that.
Telling you, it's inevitable.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, everything will be simulated. Thank you all so much for taking the time to chat with me about what you've been working on and your thoughts in this area. And thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Bye.